Okay, I think we've got most people back on now, so without much more ado, I will hand over to Dr. Hodgson for her paper on the cult of saints in medieval Scotland. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Lucy. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today, and thanks everyone for coming in person and on the VC. So the aim of my paper today is to explore the interaction between Cistercian monasteries in Scotland and locally relevant saints' cults, focusing on the evidence that's been left to us in liturgical manuscripts. So just to explain, first of all, the Cistercians were one of many new religious orders that emerged throughout the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The mother house of the order was the Abbey of Citeaux in Burgundy, France, and that was founded in the year 1098. Citeaux then went on to found daughter houses, and then these houses founded their own daughter houses, or they incorporated existing religious communities who had essentially converted to the Cistercian way of life. So by about the year 1200, there were over 500 Cistercian houses all throughout Europe. The Cistercians first arrived in Britain in 1128, and Melrose was the first Scottish house, which was founded in 1136. And the community at Melrose was colonised from Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, as was Dundrennan in 1142. And then it was from these two houses that 8 of the 9 other Scottish Cistercian abbeys came from. Throughout the Cistercian network, standardisation was maintained by a centralised ruling body called the General Chapter, and this hosted an annual meeting of abbots. There was also a network affiliation, so basically all of the mother houses were responsible for keeping an eye on their daughter houses, and this helped to enforce the concept of a collective Cistercian identity and the sense of belonging to a larger organisation on both a national and an international level. The Cistercians followed the rule of St. Benedict, as many other religious orders did, but they considered their interpretation of the rule to be its truest observance. So this involved the simplification of practices and the reduction of the liturgy, which included greatly restricting the observance of feast days. Saints accorded feasts within the earliest Cistercian calendar were limited to those common to all churches of Roman origin, though many feasts were subsequently added or had their commemorations raised in rank by official statutes of the General Chapter. Cistercian liturgical practices remained centrally controlled in this way all throughout the medieval period, and generally did maintain a high degree of uniformity despite the vast geographical spread of the order's empire. But one area where divergences are consistently evident is in the celebration of saints. Variances in the composition of calendars and litanies were individualised to the extent that the inclusion of particular cults can often be used to identify the house of origin for monastic manuscripts. In some cases, these differences emerged through special permissions for particular feasts, which were requested by and then granted to either regional groupings or individual houses. Additionally, though, there was also widespread unsanctioned observance of saints. The existing historiography concerning Cistercian engagement with saints' cults has highlighted the importance of local factors in shaping monastic practice. So at an institutional level, the Cistercian order has been credited with being very responsive to local context, something that's been noted as key to the success of its houses in such a broad range of settings. Much of that discussion is focused upon the impact of external pressures to meet the expectations of the laity, and also the conscious appropriation of local culture, often as a means of fostering legitimacy or for financial gain. So in Galloway, for example, Keith Stringers argued that the Cistercians exploited native religious heritage in the form of saints' cults as a way of making their arrival more palatable to local society. Certainly, the cult of saints played a crucial role in medieval religiosity, and so did represent a key point of interaction between Cistercian institutions and their localities. So the evidence that we find in liturgical sources has the potential to make a significant contribution to our understanding of the ways in which the practices of individual Cistercian houses engaged with and also reflected local religious culture. This type of evidence survives for 4 medieval Cistercian abbeys in Scotland. All of these manuscripts contain divergences from the standard Cistercian liturgy, and the blend of saints for each house was unique. These variances have not yet been the subject of contextualised or comparative analysis in published work. However, the Scottish Cistercians as a group have been criticised in this area for ignoring local customs due to a perceived lack of native saints in the monastic calendars. But obviously medieval religious culture was far more nuanced than this, so talk of Scottish saints in a geographical sense misses the point. The manuscripts contain numerous non-Scottish but also non-Cistercian saints, which are no less indicative of the impact of local cultural context. So the sources under discussion here are, firstly, a 14th century breviary of Sweetheart Abbey, which contains a calendar. Now, the location of this manuscript had been unknown since 1715 until it appeared on sale at an auction in Vienna and then was acquired by the National Library of Scotland in 2016. So that's only very recently been rediscovered. It hasn't been officially dated, except by me now. So the latest alteration to the official Cistercian calendar, which is correctly reflected in the Sweetheart calendar, is the addition of the conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was added in 1356. And then the Feast of St Anne, Mother of Mary, which was added in 1366, is missing. Obviously, though, we need to be very tentative about dating the manuscript on this basis. Communication channels were heavily disrupted throughout the 14th century, and we've got no way to know exactly when this information regarding changes to the official calendar may have arrived at Sweetheart. We also have a 15th century Psalter of Burris Abbey, which contains a calendar and a litany, a calendar of Cooperangus Abbey dated 1482, and a 16th century Psalter of Kinloss Abbey, which contains a litany only. These represent the only such survivals for Scottish Cistercian abbeys, but they do cover quite a wide geographical spread, from Galloway down in the southwest, through Fife and Tayside, up to Moray in the northeast. The majority of the focus here today is going to be on the calendars, since the development of the Cistercian Litany of Saints is far harder to trace in the surviving records. The calendars of Burris and Sweetheart differentiate between 2 main rankings, though these details are not always given. And these rankings are feasts of 12 lessons with either 1 or 2 masses, or commemorations, which is the lesser ranking. Feasts of particular significance in these 2 calendars are recorded in red. The Cooper calendar, unfortunately, doesn't contain details of ranking or differentiate by colour. The first point of interest is that St Bridget of Kildare appears in all 3 calendars and in both litanies. This saint was accorded a commemoration in the official Cistercian calendar, but from 1222, Scottish houses received permission to elevate this and celebrate it as a feast of 12 lessons. These types of permissions for all houses within a particular kingdom, either to add or elevate a feast, particularly one of special regional significance, were not unusual. So, for example, English houses had permission to commemorate King Edward the Confessor from 1235, and Irish houses had permission for St Patrick from 1274. But given the lack of historiographical acknowledgement of the significance of Bridget's cult in Scotland, that Scottish Cistercian houses should lobby for this is worthy of attention. If you look at the place name evidence, this reveals the diffusion of the cult throughout most of Scotland, with a noticeable concentration in the southwest. This likely reflects a greater prominence for the cult in this area, also evident in the fact that Bridget's feast is one of those written in red for Sweetheart Abbey, but not for that of Burris. Now, it's been argued that this reflects patterns of settler immigration from Ireland. It's also been suggested that, as in Ireland, a major factor in the spread of the cult is likely to have been the conflation between St Bridget with the popular pre-Christian goddess of the same name. So the cult may have inherited a nationwide network of established holy sites and devotees and accelerated the spread of the cult across Scotland. The saint's importance throughout the whole medieval kingdom is evidenced by naming practices like Gilbride, and also by the widespread location of dedications. The extent and nature of the cult by the 16th century is revealed by the poem of David Lindsay, The Monarchy, in which Bridget's cult is singled out for what Lindsay regards as idolatrous practices. And Lindsay complains that the saint was venerated by the common population of Scotland to keep calf and coo. Aside from this regional significance, the cult may have caught the attention of the monks due to Bridget's medieval association with the Virgin Mary, to whom the Cistercians had a special devotion. So all Cistercian houses were dedicated to Mary. Contemporary writers often highlighted the shared virtues and traits between Bridget and Mary, and this gained Bridget the epithet Mary of the Gael. But if that is the case, it does seem odd that it should be the Scottish rather than the Irish Cistercians who should latch onto this. Because surely we can't argue for a greater attachment to the cult in Scotland than in Ireland, where Bridget was one of the premier national saints. Irish houses obtained no such permission for special observance of the feast, and it's unclear as to why the Scottish Cistercians in particular should have singled Bridget out. So it may be that the significance of her cult in Scotland has been underestimated by historians. Another category of common additions to Cistercian calendars was saints with cult centres under the control of particular houses, and the most obvious of these here is the cult of St Seraph at Burris. The hagiographical material, which predates the Cistercian abbey, records that Burris was the site of St Seraph's principal church and also the place of his burial. Certainly, the existence of an early Christian foundation at Burris is indicated by the presence of 8th or 9th century carved stones at the site. And an active cult of St Seraph in the area is confirmed by a charter of David I, which dates to the 1140s and is addressed to Gil Seraph of Clackmannan, a place just 6 miles away. The Cistercian house of Burris, founded later in 1217, hosted the shrine of St Seraph, to whom the abbey was co-dedicated along with the Virgin Mary, and its abbot was often referred to as the abbot of St Seraph in Scottish charters. So, unsurprisingly, Seraph appears in both the calendar and the litany of Burris. There's no record of official permission for this, but the connection between saint and abbey is acknowledged in the records of the Cistercian order, where the abbey is also referred to as St Seraph's. These types of cults were not necessarily hosted in-house. Others were situated in churches or chapels under monastic control. The inclusion of St Medon in the calendar of Cooper Angus is one such example. The abbey received permission to celebrate this feast with 2 masses in 1273. The cult of this apparently Irish saint was highly localised, primarily focused around Kirkmaiden in Galloway, but another concentrated pocket also existed in Angus, centred on the area around the parish church of Airlie, dedicated to Medon, which stood around 10 miles from Cooper. This church came into the possession of the monks through a grant made in 1219 by King Alexander II. By this date, the abbey had already acquired the land of Airlie to establish a grange. There was St Medon's Well and Hill, which stood close by, and also the nearby church of Lintraden was also dedicated to Medon. Evidence indicates that both Airlie and Lintraden Church, these medieval churches, stood on sites that had originally been earlier religious sites, and these dedications were likely carried over from older traditions. That Airlie was a Celtic church site explains the existence of the Apdane of Airlie, and this is a term which denotes an endowment of land belonging to an old church. And the Apdane of Airlie was initially leased by Cooper from the Bishop of St Andrews in 1212 and appears to become a permanent part of the monastic grange there. The abbey also acquired further land in the vicinity at Lintraden in the 1250s. So, by 1273, when they lobbied for permission to celebrate the feast, the abbey had established interest in the heart of an area with a strong tradition of Medon's cult, in addition to custody of the church, which appears to have been its focal point. Continued local devotion to the cult in the period contemporary to the surviving monastic calendar is revealed by a document of 1447, which records that Michael David, hereditary keeper of the Bell of St Medon, had resigned it into the hands of Sir John Ogilvie of Lintraden at Airlie Castle. Another similar example that we could perhaps point to here is the inclusion of St Patrick in the calendar of Sweetheart Abbey, which had controlled the patronage of the nearby church of Kirkpatrick, Durham, from the time of the abbey's foundation, situated about 11 miles away. Even if that were not the case, though, it wouldn't be surprising to find Padraig included in the liturgy of that house, because the cult was very prominent in southwest Scotland, where the saint was patron of multiple parish churches and various other dedications to him existed. That Patrick's feast also made its way into the calendar of Burris would appear to indicate that the cult was also active in close vicinity to the abbey in Fife. And this is a suggestion borne out by an individual named Gilpatrick, who was one of a number of local men who perambulated the nearby land of Dunduff in 1231. And another of the local men who attended this same perambulation was named Gil Thomas. It's possible that that individual was named for Thomas the Apostle, but equally likely is Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, canonised in 1173. Becket's feast on the 29th of December was part of the official Cistercian calendar, added in 1185 and then elevated to 2 masses in 1191, and the saint was also added to the litany officially in 1214. So the feast appears in all 3 calendars and in red for both Burris and Sweetheart, and the saint is included in both litanies. At Burris, though, the calendar indicates that the house also observed the octave of this feast on the 5th of January, also given in red, as well as the translation of Becket's relics on the 7th of July, neither of which feature in the Universal Cistercian calendar. The explanation for this lies in the influence of Canterbury in the locality, which was entrenched long before the foundation of the Cistercian abbey. Burris was situated just 6 miles from Dunfermline Abbey, a Benedictine monastery founded by a group of monks from Canterbury in the 1120s, nearly a century before Burris itself was established. The liturgical practices of Dunfermline were heavily influenced by this link. A contemporary 15th century calendar and litany from Dunfermline feature many Canterbury elements aside from Becket. Similarly, the liturgical practices of Burris reflect those of Dunfermline in the addition of another unofficial saint to the abbey's calendar and litany, St Margaret of Scotland, who does not appear in the liturgy of any of the other 3 Cistercian houses. Dunfermline was the location of Margaret's shrine and also the centre for her cult. So it seems very likely that the observance of Becket at Burris reflected what had become the established religious calendar for the locality long before Burris was founded and evidently continuing long afterwards. That suggestion is further supported by the exclusion of another Becket feast at both Burris and Dunfermline, and this was his return from exile, which was celebrated on the 2nd of December. The Regressio was observed at Canterbury and also at Arbroath Abbey, which was the principal centre for Becket's cult in Scotland. But it doesn't feature in either the Burris calendar or the contemporary Dunfermline calendar, further emphasising that Burris's observance of Becket reflected local practice. Now, it could be suggested that institutional interest in Becket was unlikely to have been shared by the local lay population by the time the Psalter was produced in the 15th century, because this was following an extended period of Anglo-Scottish conflict. However, it would appear that devotion to the cult of this English saint was still alive and well long after the outbreak of war in 1296, and research done has emphasised the durability of spiritual ties despite these national hostilities, and has strongly challenged the notion that devotion to Becket declined in Scotland. Another cross-border saint found in all 3 calendars and both litanies is Cuthbert. Again, Cuthbert's feast on the 20th of March was included in the official Cistercian calendar, added in 1226, but only at the rank of commemoration. The calendars of Burris and Sweetheart reveal that these houses were observing it as the higher ranking feast of 12 lessons, and if we remember, the Cooper calendar doesn't actually record rankings, but most likely it was the same there. We could view the attachment to Cuthbert as having quite a distinctly Cistercian element in Scotland. So Aelred of Revo, which was the Yorkshire Abbey which headed the network of affiliation to which all of the Scottish houses discussed here belonged, was a dedicated patron of Cuthbert's cult. And the cult was then disseminated widely via the Cistercian network, and a number of Cuthbertine manuscripts were either produced by or for houses on the continent, including Citeaux, the French mother house of the order. And this connection to the saint was even more direct for Scottish houses. Cuthbert had been prior of the monastery at Old Melrose in the 7th century. When the Cistercian house at Melrose was founded in 1136, the older site was retained as a chapel dedicated to Cuthbert. A direct link between these old and new monastic communities was drawn in the early 13th century life of the Cistercian St Waldolf, Abbot of Melrose, which records the opening of the tomb in 1171 and declares that Waldolf was a companion for St Cuthbert, once a monk of Melrose. We can see continued interest in the cult revealed by an indulgence granted in 1321 to aid the rebuilding of this chapel after it was burned, and then another indulgence granted in 1437 for those who visited it on St Cuthbert's feast. In addition to this, the Cura's calendar includes the unofficial feast of Cuthbert's translation on the 4th of September. Cuthbert's cult had been active in the area around Curas long before the Cistercian Abbey was founded. We know this from a miracle collection that was produced between 1165 and 1172 by an individual called Reginald of Durham, and this recorded a healing miracle which had taken place at Dunfermline while Cuthbert's relics were carried in a procession for St Margaret's feast, and it also notes that a number of gifts were given for Cuthbert that day. But despite this evidence for Scottish devotion to the cult during the earlier period, Cuthbert's image would later become strongly associated with English military victories over the Scots through the systematic exploitation of the saint as a propaganda tool by English monarchs from the late 13th century onwards. And this relationship was physically manifested in the banner of St Cuthbert carried by English armies. So, similar to the case of Thomas Becket, an argument could be made that veneration of English nationalistic cults like that of Cuthbert during this period would seem to confirm a perception of monasteries in Scotland as foreign bodies, whose focuses of devotion could be quite separate from that of the native population. But in fact, the evidence shows that despite English efforts to monopolise Cuthbert, a wholly distinct image of the saint was operating in Scotland at the same time. So Tom Turpey points to the example of Walter Bower's Chronicon, which was a 15th century Scottish chronicle renowned for its Anglophobic rhetoric, which presents a positive image of a saint who'd done the Scots much good. This goes as far as Bower associating Cuthbert with a Scottish victory against the English in 1298. That veneration of the cult in Scotland during the 14th century and beyond continued is evidenced by the inclusion of Cuthbert's feast in both institutional and private liturgical books, together with new altar dedications. And it's also clear that the use of Cuthbert as a personal name remained unproblematic and prominent in southern Scotland. So Turpey concludes that for the majority of late medieval Scots, Cuthbert had not become a partisan supporter of English arms, but remained a powerful monk from Melrose. So the cult of Cuthbert clearly endured in Scotland far beyond Cistercian houses. While the discussion so far has demonstrated the close connection between the practices of these Cistercian houses and local culture, we could perhaps make a case for some noticeable omissions. It's been commented that the absence of St Kentigern from the Cura's calendar is surprising. Now, this is due to the hagiographical tradition that Kentigern was born at Curas and then raised and educated there by St Serf. But this is actually easily explainable. So, St Kentigern was patron of Glasgow Cathedral, and the development and spread of his cult, which appears to have attracted little interest before around 1100, was closely tied to the increasing power and influence of Glasgow diocese and the promotional activities of various bishops. The association between Serf and Kentigern appears in two 12th century lives of Kentigern, and these were both commissioned by bishops of Glasgow. Meanwhile, the life of St Serf, the original text of which appears to have originated at Curas before the Cistercian foundation, makes no mention of Kentigern. In fact, we find no reference to Kentigern in the area prior to 1503, when a bishop of Glasgow founded a chapel dedicated to Kentigern near to the monastery, an event which postdates the Curas Psalter. So, while Serf was evidently a feature of the cult of Kentigern at Glasgow, Kentigern was not a part of Serf's cult in Fife. Meanwhile, we do find Kentigern's feast in the calendar of the only house under consideration here situated in the Diocese of Glasgow, Sweetheart Abbey. Research has shown that Kentigern was certainly a regionally significant saint across southern Scotland, and popular and engagement with the cult among the inhabitants of the diocese and neighbouring lands was sustained from the 12th to the 16th century. It's also been argued that by the late 13th century, the bishops of Glasgow had managed to construct an institutionalised relationship between the exercise of temporal lordship in the region and reverence for the cult of St Kentigern. So, particularly pertinent here is the charter of Dornoch Balliol, who was founder of Sweetheart Abbey, whose 1277 grant to Glasgow Cathedral of Lands in Ayrshire named St Kentigern as the beneficiary. So the inclusion in the Sweetheart calendar and the omission from the Couros calendar of Kentigern actually reflects the true geographical spread of devotion to the cult. Now, the promotional activities of the bishops of Glasgow could easily have provided an opportunity for the Cistercians at Couros to monopolise St Kentigern and Fife and try and promote the abbey as a secondary centre for the cult, which would potentially have been a very profitable venture. But there's no evidence that the monks ever showed any interest in this. And that type of failure to exploit the potential of certain saints' cults is even more evident in the case of the Cooperangus calendar. Property records reveal that this abbey possessed a set of cult chapels with a variety of saintly dedications. The revenue generated by these chapels belonged to Cooper, and the abbey was active in maintaining them. But a comparison of the patrons of these chapels with the monastic calendar reveals a very clear disconnect between the commemoration of saints on one hand and the cults which this house had a strong socio-political or financial incentive to observe and promote on the other. Perhaps the most prominent of these was St Margaret of Scotland, who is missing from the Cooper calendar. The abbey had founded a chapel dedicated to the saint at Forfar in 1234 and had evidently been recruited by King Alexander II to help promote the cult as part of his campaign to have Margaret canonised. The abbey continued to fund a resident chaplain for the chapel into the 16th century. Additionally, St Ninian is also missing, despite Cooper controlling the profits of two chapels dedicated to him, as is St Findoc, who was patron of another of the abbey's chapels. Cooper's calendar does, however, include St Adomnan, the influential 7th century abbot of Iona. The feast was not part of the Cistercian calendar, and there's no evidence that Cooper was actually granted permission to celebrate it. The abbey's link to Adomnan lay in a chapel dedicated to this saint situated at Cooper's land of Campsie. Evidence for the cult of Adomnan itself reveals an early medieval concentration of devotion within the Diocese of Dunkeld, which had very close links to Iona. This includes a series of dedications all along the route from Iona to Dunkeld, which Simon Taylor has argued date to the 7th or 8th century. And if we continue this route eastward along the River Tay past Dunkeld, it arrives at Campsie. And Campsie itself fell within Cargill, which was a detached parish of Dunkeld Diocese. So this strongly suggests that an early religious site associated with St Adomnan existed at Campsie, and the cult was probably deeply rooted in local tradition. But the chapel itself was incorporated into the abbot's residence as a household chapel and was not actually accessible to the local population. So this decision to incorporate a saint of clear local significance into the liturgical life and also the material fabric of the abbey, but keep the chapel private, doesn't sit well with standard explanations of Cistercian appropriation of local culture or the concept of the promotion of cults for profit, since evidently neither were a factor here. Instead, we could perhaps look to internal monastic interest in St Adomnan, since the nature of the abbey's engagement with the cult seems to speak more to the personal devotions of the monks themselves, and it seems likely that the figure of Adomnan had caught their imagination as an example of an ideal abbot. Indeed, it could be argued that other of the liturgical deviations outlined here may reflect the personal devotions of the abbey's inhabitants rather than anything more purposeful or strategic on an institutional level. If this is the case, the inclusion of particular saints may in many cases reflect patterns of monastic recruitment from particular localities. Cistercian houses only accepted adult converts, So these men had lived in the outside world and they'd had their religious devotions moulded by this. While the Cistercian order sought to maintain uniformity and try to lessen the liturgical burden through restricting the observance of feast days, there's nothing to suggest that once recruited, personal reverence of other saints was discouraged. On the contrary, Cistercian monks often produced works of hagiography and collections of miracles pertaining to saints who were not in the official calendar. And historians have noted the prevalence within Cistercian libraries of works relating to locally venerated saints. So it may have been a natural progression to incorporate saints whose exclusion from the liturgical year seems particularly jarring to the abbey's inhabitants. That may go some way towards explaining the responsiveness of Cistercian houses to their regional settings and the absorption of local religious culture into their practices. So the discussion so far has highlighted the local context for the cults observed at particular houses. If the monks of these houses were recruited from within these local settings, then we would fully expect that they would share an attachment to saints revered by local communities, since they themselves were also members of these communities. Obviously, that's not to deny the validity of other factors highlighted by the existing historiography, but just to add a further and important dimension to our understanding of this. So the point can be quite difficult to demonstrate definitively, since it's very rare to find the names of individual monks recorded before the 16th century. Even in the case of Couprangus Abbey, for which the survival rate of documentation is far superior than for the other three houses discussed here. But it's not difficult to find examples even within the very limited evidence space. So we've got an incidental reference that reveals by 1200 the prior of Cooper was a member of the landholding family of Meagle, which is located just 5 miles from the abbey. The handful of other names which do appear reveal the recruitment from Cooper's sphere of landholding, and several of these men bear names taken from lands which bordered the abbey's closest granges. It's also clearly apparent from the evidence that a notable proportion of the monks of Couprangus were drawn from the Burgess families of the towns of Perth and Dundee, where the abbey possessed extensive property. The names of these individuals can be found regularly from the early 13th century all the way through to the late 15th century when the calendar was produced and beyond. Elsewhere, we find both Thomas of Kirkcudbright and William of Greenlaw at Sweetheart Abbey, while Adam of Stirling was abbot of Couris. And these were places that were under 20 miles away from their respective abbeys. Our best snapshot in time of the internal makeup of a particular house, although at an earlier date than the manuscripts we're talking about here, is the very unusual and valuable survival for Kinloss Abbey of a charter dating to 1229, which lists the names of 25 monks. And a third of these can be shown to be local men, including individuals such as Roger of Moy, which was land located less than 5 miles from the abbey. Aside from the local dimension, recruitment patterns may also help to account for the inclusion of saints which at first glance seem more unexpected. For example, the addition of St Duthac to the Cooper calendar. This cult had been of only local significance, focused around the shrine at Tain, at a substantial distance from even the abbey's most northerly lands. However, by the mid-14th century, the saint had become prominent in the borough of Aberdeen, which would develop into a secondary centre for the cult. From here, Duthac's cult spread along seaborne trading routes as it became popular amongst the mercantile and urban elite of Scotland's east coast boroughs. So, considering the apparent predominance of men from the boroughs amongst the general population of Couprangus Abbey, the influence of the personal devotions of these urban recruits upon in-house practices is the most plausible explanation for the presence of St Duthac in the calendar. And the addition may date to the abbacy of an individual particularly amenable to request to do so. William de Leadhouse, a monk of Cooper who became abbot in the early 15th century, appears to have been a member of a Burgess family of Aberdeen. So, to round this off then, historians have rightly highlighted the impact of local context upon Cistercian practice across Europe, and the individualised nature of the practices of particular abbeys has been demonstrated. But within this discussion, there is a tendency to treat these houses as faceless institutions, rather than communities of individuals. Cistercian monks themselves did not constitute an homogeneous group, within either particular kingdoms, regions, or even individual abbeys. And the identities of these men must have played a part in shaping the character of the house. Despite the shortage of available evidence in many cases, it seems safe to assume that Cistercian houses in Scotland were recruiting adult men drawn from local communities in potentially influential numbers from at least the early 13th century onwards. So the types of pressures felt from external lay populations, often cited as the key factor in shaping Cistercian interaction with saints' cults, were actually just as likely to come from within the monastery itself. In this context, there's also a need to address the tendency to divide Cistercian liturgical practice with regards to saints from that of the general population. While the historiography almost invariably considers the interaction between abbeys and saints' cults from the perspective of what it can tell us about Cistercian practices, if monastic observance is a true reflection of local devotion, then the evidence can also be used in the other direction to tell us about local religious culture. Considering the amount of research still to be done in Scotland in this area, and also the difficulty in discerning these more intangible cultural elements from the available source material, the choice of saints included in or excluded from liturgical manuscripts may offer a good indication of the character of lay religiosity, which the cult of saints played such a central role in. So, incorporating the Cistercians into the wider discussion, rather than considering these monks as a separate entity within society, can help us to offer a fuller picture of the experience of religion across varying regional contexts in medieval Scotland. Thank you.
I'm just going to take your PowerPoint slides down so that people can see you. Oops, no, not with that one. There we go. Okay. So I would like to open the floor now to questions. Is there any questions from the room before I go out to VC and ask if there's any questions there? Stunned them all into silence. Thank you.
Besides the local connections, when you talk about St Dussek of Tay, we had royal pilgrimages over the years, so would there be a kind of fashion like there is now to follow royalty to Balmoral, etc., to spread things just by the fashion of royalty?
Yeah, that has been suggested, but the research that's been done into it suggests that despite kind of royal interest, the cult actually never becomes particularly fashionable at court. So it does seem to be, it's the urban elite that spread it rather than what you would normally expect. It's not kind of traditional noble connections that spread it. It is these boroughs that tend to seem to be anyway. That it's Tom Turpey's research that suggested that. But yeah, he argues that it never actually really catches on from the king. That it is actually these burgesses that are the people that spread it.
The evidence of specific sects being introduced into the litanies, does that come from the printed or psalters of the time from each particular abbey?
No, so it usually comes from the kind of centralised record keeping. So all the changes to the liturgy would have been statutes issued by the general chapter. So it's through those records that you see it being recorded that saints have been added. It's much easier to trace additions to the calendar than the litany because it seems like those records aren't as complete, which is why I focus more on the calendar. But yeah, you can see it. It's at these annual meetings, everyone gets told these are the saints to add, basically.
Yeah, because abbeys can introduce now, certainly, saints at will into their litanies to fit in with the particular celebration. But of course you can't alter the calendar because that is separate.
Yeah, so we do see official additions to the litany, but yeah, it's much less, seems to be much less policed than the calendar, so it's difficult to, whereas you can kind of see in a calendar exactly what should and shouldn't be there at what dates. It's much more difficult to follow the development of the Cistercian litany but theoretically it should have all been standardised, uniform, unless you have a special permission.
Thank you.
Can I ask whether you've considered pilgrims and pilgrimage spreading cult through Europe? And the reason I raise it, some of us here are from taking pilgrimage, and recently we've discovered a 1320 set of two pictures painted on the walls of Cologne Cathedral, obviously a great pilgrimage cathedral, of St Kentigern and St Darthach.
Oh, right.
The earliest known pictures of these two saints. And we have no idea why they were painted there, but pilgrimage?
Yeah, I mean, potentially for the Cistercian monks are not allowed to leave the abbey without permission, and they're not meant to go on pilgrimage, although a trade does develop in paying monks to go on pilgrimage for you in the later medieval period. But it's probably much more likely that it is recruitment patterns rather than, so people coming in rather than people going out and bringing it back. But yeah, that's an interesting element to think about then. I'll talk to you about those images afterwards.
I'd just like to ask, out on VC, are there any questions out on VC if people would like to come in and ask questions?
Yes.
Everyone's shy.
Yeah, everyone's shy, yeah. Are there any more questions in the room? Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned St Darthach. Are there any more northern saints in these calendar?
Yeah, give me 2 seconds. Get a slide back up. Yeah, so unfortunately, the Kinloss manuscript doesn't have a calendar, it only has a litany, which is a source of great irritation to me. But, and because the litany is so much harder to trace, then I haven't focused massively on it. Give me 2 seconds to get my slide up. Alright, do you want to maybe put that one back up?
I can put it back up, but it will be that only we can see it in the room, that's all.
Right, okay.
Which one do you want?
Yeah, so those are the additions to the Kinloss litany. So yeah, I haven't massively focused on that just because it is harder to analyse litanies than calendars. But one thing that might be interesting to follow up on is St Jerome at Kinloss. There seems to be, although the evidence base is so limited, that there is a particular focus on Jerome at Kinloss, and I don't know if that's a local interest or not, or if it's just a personal favourite of maybe a particular abbot. But there definitely is an altar and a lot of interest. So yeah, I would be interested to know if that's locally significant or if it is an internal thing. But yeah, so these are the saints and all the additions, or unofficial additions.
Oh, Jim, sorry, I thought you were waving at me.
You mentioned Adam and Bridget, obviously. What's the sort of general breakdown of saints in this context as between, for lack of a better term, the Celtic tradition and the non-Celtic tradition? Most of the saints you mentioned would be coming from a non-Gallic background. Is that correct? Adam and Bridget are obviously exceptions to that. Are there others?
I mean, so a couple of them, again, that slide, but yeah, I think
I'm just wondering if, at this point, certainly in the Cistercian context, did that have any kind of meaning, that kind of...
Well, yeah, that is something that has been picked up on before, to say, that the Cistercians, they ignore what's come before, they're part of the Anglicisation of the Scottish Church, but it does seem to be that they pick up on what are just contemporary significant cults. So potentially you're not looking at them ignoring, Gaelic or native saints. It's that by the dates of the manuscripts anyway, interest in those saints has waned anyway. But it's so difficult because the lack of just lay evidence for that type of interest, and you're always reliant on placing evidence or dedications, which can be really difficult to date. That's why I was kind of trying to say that maybe you can use these to look in the opposite direction. So maybe it's not a case of they're ignoring things around them. It's that it actually reflects what the populations around them are focused on themselves. But yeah, it's a really difficult one to answer. There are some really interesting, pretty obscure ones in there. I mean, Medin, there's not even clear who Medin is. It seems to be a conflation of maybe 3 different people at some point. But yeah, there's definitely some kind of really localised interest around Airlie in that cult, which... there's a couple of ones that are definitely really highly localised individuals. That didn't really answer your question, sorry.
And I think we've got a question over here.
I'm just interested in St. Philin, when he's disappeared. Just because I was brought up near St. Philin, we know about St. Philin. I noticed he's venerated at, what was it, Curith?
Yeah. Nothing, basically, which is why I didn't discuss it there, because, so a couple of the ones that I'm most interested in, there's no work being done on at all, which is why I haven't discussed them, because that needs done from scratch, basically. But that is one that I am definitely wanting to pick up on, because it doesn't seem to make sense that it's at Curith and not elsewhere, because when I've been looking through I can't remember exactly the locations, but in terms of the place name evidence, it doesn't make sense for them to be interested in Fife and not at other abbeys. But yeah, that's something that I did look into, but I wasn't able to come up with any plausible explanation for yet.
I wonder if is there any chance that Philin's connection to Bruce and that is perhaps something to do with it ending up at Curith?
Maybe I need to look more into that. But yeah, it doesn't make sense either that so Findoch, where all the most closest to any Cistercian houses anyway, the Findoch dedications are near to Cwprangus. The Cwprangus have a chapel to Findoch, they ignore him. But Findoch is in, I can't remember who else is that Curith maybe as well? Someone else celebrating Findoch when there's no evidence for any interest, other interest in the cult. So we might be looking at that being evidence of a previously unknown local cult. Yeah, there's loads of really random little ones like that.
Are there any other questions in the room or out on VC? Yeah.
When they penciled the saints' dates into their calendars, were they all simultaneous, celebrated on the same day, or did they have them in sequence so you could travel around and celebrate your favourite saints in kind of a sequence? No.
The monks themselves, do you mean? Or?
Yeah.
So again, the monks aren't allowed to leave. But yeah, so you've got the idea of with the Cistercian kind of condensing the liturgy is the fact that you're only meant to have, a feast day every so often throughout the month, so that you don't spend all your time doing that. But then from the kind of 13th century onwards, there's this kind of explosion where people get added at quite a rapid rate. The calendars start to look fuller and fuller.
There can be changes, I think, because your notice had St. Catholic as the 30th of December, I think. Today, it's the 8th of March.
Yeah, they have been moved after the medieval period, definitely, yeah.
I may jump in with a very quick question about emissions, and you talked about how you've not covered some saints because of not knowing details about them, but you also mentioned St. Margaret a couple of times, but that she only appears at one, and it was Ross, was it? And as she's national royal saint, I wonder if that ties in with the question about Dornoch and whether actually royal influence has very little influence on the Cistercians and what they choose to. So I just wondered what you thought of the significance of St Margaret's omission.
I think the fact that St Margaret only makes it into Curris, and like I say, it's because it's so close to Dunfermline, that would tend to suggest that it never, despite kind of royal promotion, it never really catches on because they haven't felt the need to petition as if she is the kind of national saint. So none of the rest of despite the fact that Cooper Angus is obviously involved in the kind of promotion of the cult under Alexander, they're not celebrating the feast either. So yeah, the fact that this, based on the Cistercian evidence, Bridget is a far more significant cult than Margaret, perhaps suggests kind of that's the one that nationally is the most significant for the contemporary periods anyway, and that despite the fact that there's this royal promotion of Margaret that's never really actually caught on particularly well.
So it ties in with stuff that people have said about how St Margaret's one of the seems nationally doesn't seem to get the same attention as quite a lot of the others.
It is actually an interesting one because Scottish and English houses have permission to elevate the feast of the other St Margaret from, I think it's 1268, and it's been suggested that maybe that's a mistake because obviously Margaret of Scotland as an English princess, English and Scottish houses have maybe been positioning to celebrate her feast, and that it's just been recorded, this French Cistercian scribe has recorded it as the wrong St Margaret. But based on the actual liturgical evidence, it's definitely St Margaret of Antioch's feast that's been elevated by all the houses, and the feast day of St Margaret of Scotland is, like I say, not in any of them apart from. So it's not a mistake. They have asked to elevate the other St Margaret's feast. But then you have to wonder how much conflation there's been between Margarets here, even in medieval Scotland. But so no, I would say that I think that's a pretty good indication of what is actually the genuine kind of map of devotion in Scotland, as opposed to what you would maybe think.
Thank you very much. Have we got one last question? Or we can let Vicky off the hot seat. I'm going to go with everybody's tired out now, and we could give our speaker one last round of applause. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to everyone on VC. I'm going to cut you off now. Bye.
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.